Okay. Okay, recording. Hi, everyone. Again, welcome to our talk with Dr. Paul Israel tonight. Dr. Israel is an accomplished scholar specializing in the history of invention and innovation and in patent history. And he has long led research into the work and life of Thomas Edison. In addition to his own writing and scholarship, Dr. Israel is also the director and general editor of the Thomas A. Edison papers at Rutgers University, working extensively with the organization and archiving of Edison's professional and personal documentation. These tasks include leading the development of the Thomas A. Edison papers digital editions that aim to enhance the use and interaction with the collections, as well as focus on the collection's continued preservation. So Dr. Israel will present the collection and kind of discuss these archival and digital discussions, and also open up for a Q&A with the time remaining at the end. So thank you very much, Dr. Israel. We're excited to hear from you. And
okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I thought what I would do is give a little history of the Edison papers, which has been both a, guess what one could call a documentary or historical scholarly editing project, and one that has been deeply invested in archives in various ways. When I first joined the project in the 1980s, giving my age away as if my gray hair doesn't, we started by focusing on microfilm. So I'm very interested. How many of you know what microfilm is or have ever used it? Okay, a few of you. That's good to see. So I'm going to do a quick share screen here just to give you a sense. So this is microfilm. These are microfilm readers. The library, I think, probably still has a couple of them floating around somewhere. It used to be that this is how you preserved all sorts of materials that to make them, and also make them accessible. So archives, microfilm stuff, newspapers were microfilmed, corporate records were microfilmed, all sorts of things were microfilmed. This has become, of course, a much less common form of media. And increasingly what's happened, and this is what happened with the Edison papers, is that microfilm has been digitized. And so we actually began with a 5-part, I'm just going to kind of open this up so you can get a sense of what we originally had. We had 5 parts of a microfilm edition. So Edison was born in 1847, died in 1931. We're still working on the 1920s, but our microfilm edition actually started before our book edition. And we have these nice bound volumes. The bound volumes have also gone digital. They're now on Project Muse as open access, both to view online and to download as ebooks, both PDFs and EPUBs. So increasingly, everything we do is digital. And besides the 5 parts of the microfilm, we also have been collecting stuff from other repositories. So the main repository is at the Thomas Edison National Historical Park, which is in West Orange, which is Edison's last laboratory and home. And it's a huge archive. There's an estimated 5 million pages of stuff. Now, probably about 2/3 of that is from the 19-teens and 1920s, after a multi-divisional corporation was formed to combine all of Edison's enterprises together. And as with any modern corporation, they produced a lot of paperwork and duplicate paperwork, and sometimes triplicate and even more. So what the Edison papers did was they started by going into the archive, which when we started was estimated at 1.2 million pieces of paper. And we started doing surveys and identifying all the material there, and the number kept ballooning. With the idea being that we would create first this archival microfilm edition of select documents. So of the 5 million, we'll probably end up with somewhere in the neighborhood of 150,000 documents, something like that. Plus we've acquired another 30,000 pages of stuff from other repositories. So there's a lot of stuff. And when we started, the Edison Papers was also organizing the material in the archives, because some of it was not in very good shape in terms of the way it had been maintained over the years. And so we ended up doing a lot of reorganization and organization of materials that had not been very well maintained. Part of this was what had happened after Edison's death and how the archive had been managed or not managed very well by mostly people without any training in archives. So a good reason for you all to get training, so that archives like the one at the Edison National Historical Park are properly taken care of. So our archival edition, just to give you a sense of it, we focused on some key collections. So the notebooks, obviously the laboratory records are important. So the notebooks and laboratory records are key things. Edison took out 1,093 patents, as well as several others that he applied for. So some of these are patent files for patents that he never actually received. There are a lot of litigation records, because one of the things about the patent system is, in order to protect your patents, sometimes you have to sue other people, and Edison did a fair amount of that over the years. There was this thing called the document file, which is what we spent a lot of time on in the early years, because this was a mess. For example, in 1878, the year that Edison first tries to market his tinfoil phonograph, which was the first version of his phonograph, there were like 70 odd folders related to the phonograph, many of which had 1 or 2 documents in them, because they had actually been using the file as a research index. Instead of creating an index file, they had just started sorting stuff regarding the kinds of questions and inquiries they were getting. So we did a little reorganization of that. So the document file is basically Edison's incoming correspondence files. And then as well, most of you have probably never seen a letter book. So these are bound volumes with tissue paper. And basically, when the ink is still wet, you can press the original against one of these tissue papers. You put it in a letter press, one of those, looks like the old-fashioned, I don't know if you've ever seen old-fashioned early printing presses, where they basically just screwed down and tightened the type against a piece of paper to print it. Well, essentially the same principle, right? So it would transfer the ink, some of the ink, from the original to the letter book. And there are a lot of these. That's how they kept records until the beginning of carbon copies, which does emerge with typewriters, which is one of the things that changes over the years. So even the kinds of records we have change over time. We have a lot of various kinds of legal files that were there. There are various kinds of scrapbooks and clippings, and then published materials from various companies. There are various kinds of special collections that were donated that ended up in the archive, papers of individuals who had been associated with Edison that ended up back in the archive, and then a lot of company records of one sort or another. And then we have a lot of family records. And in fact, one of the things that And because we were doing microfilm, when we had to add stuff that we found later, we did it as supplements to the microfilm. But one of the things we did as well is we took all the family records. So a lot of them are in the archive, but then there are large numbers of collections that come from other places. And so there are actually four other large collections of family papers. And so we've been adding that as well. So the microfilm is where we started. Then we started doing the books because now we had materials that we could look at. And fortunately, around 2000, well, in fact, in 2000, we put up our digital image edition. We started working on it a couple of years earlier to digitize the microfilm. Fortunately, the first director of the project, Reese Jenkins, had gotten advice from the editor of the Joseph Henry papers. Joseph Henry is the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, a major figure in American science in the middle of the 19th century. And he suggested that we, for internal purposes, we do a lot of indexing. And so that turned out to be a good thing, because now we have all this metadata related to documents, who they're written by, if they were sent to somebody who received them, name mentions. We have subjects encoded in our metadata. We even have things like whether there's marginalia or whether it's a foreign language. Some of those have not yet been added to our digital edition, which is now on the Omeka S platform. So if you haven't heard of Omeka, this is a platform that was developed by the folks at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. There's an older version, sort of informally known as Classic Omeka, which is just called Omeka. And then there's Omeka S, which is has better capabilities for the kind of scale of the Edison papers and enables us to create different sets of materials, and also enables us to have materials in more than one place in the collections. Although it's the same image, we can add a document into another collection. So one of the things that Monica did was we also began to think about a bigger problem that all sorts of digital projects, including ours, have, and that's how to think about the long term. We still haven't solved that problem, and this, I think, is one of the key things for any of you going into digital archive work of one sort or another, is how that digital project will be maintained and made accessible over a long period of time. And that's something we're still working on. So we decided that we would try to do what, in a sense, is a traditional form of publishing, which is you deposit your work in more than one library. So we realized that the Internet Archive, which is archive.org, which has tried to make itself the library of the internet, in a sense. You can find old websites archived here. A lot of various organizations, including a lot of research libraries and other organizations, have been putting materials on the Internet Archive. Just to give you a little sense of the kind of range of, and just go to their main page here. Oops, there we go. Right, so they've got, this will give you a sense, and what are all those things? So there's web, books, video, audio, stuff from television. This is software, images, various kinds of recordings, I don't remember what this one is. Oh, those are collections. So this is just to give you a sense, right, of the large number of collections, right? So there's Moving Image Archive, American Libraries. There's just a lot of stuff here. So we decided that we would try to preserve initially just our microfilm edition. So we put the microfilm online. So this is the Edison papers main page. We have a description of the collections that we have here. Oops, I guess that went away. We originally just put up the microfilm, and Monica can talk more about that in the discussion. And then we decided to add the notebooks. One of the mistakes we made was adding it to the microfilm originally, and now we're trying to separate out the notebooks and the microfilm from the main collection. We're going to add other materials. We have, for example, a large collection of motion picture catalogs. So we have, this is our new website that's not live yet, but I want to just show you. So the motion picture catalogs includes, so it was 6 reels. There was a guide to it. This is the guide, which kind of discusses motion picture history and the catalogs. And then we have these reel notes, and you can go into each of these and actually now get to these, take a moment to load here, these PDFs, which are in RU Core, the Rutgers repository of all these catalogs that originally were collected from a variety of different archives. Just to give you a sense, let's see if the these are all the archives that this collection came from. So we've created a collection that doesn't exist anywhere else by bringing all these together and then making them accessible. So, the project is doing sort of a combination of publishing traditional scholarly work, such as our book edition, and then making these archival materials more accessible. So this is our new digital edition. So in the, oops, where are we here? So in this, we just go back to these lists, right? Each of these is what we call an item set. It's either a folder or a volume. And you can actually browse or search our item sets. So they're in order by identifier at the moment. So the account series, which start with A, show up first, document file, C is company record. So you can sort of see the order that they're in from that. You can do an advanced search, which allows you to also just search their descriptions and titles, which is a good way to get at material. You can search individual documents, but let me just go back to the browse for a moment and just, let me just go in here and do, let's go to something besides the, whoops, hit one twice there we go, 10. So here is something from the document file. So let's see, let's find something that might be kind of interesting here. You know, what we got here. So let's go down to 78. There's a lot more. So the Edison file is right. So this is a collection of materials that's correspondence by or about the Edison's family, for example. This lists them by the order that they appear on the microfilm, actually. You can also sort them by date, either ascending or descending. You can then view them in the viewer that we have, right? And then go back and look at another letter. or you can open them up as individual items. So I'll just do that in another window, and this will give you a sense of the metadata we have. So we do have abstracts for a lot of these that we are have come from notes that we took for our book edition. So each volume includes about 350 to 400 pages, and the number of documents for most of the volumes is in the 6,000 to 10,000 range. So we have to know what's in those documents in order to even begin to work with them. And so we have these abstracts. Sometimes they're full transcriptions that haven't been proofread. They each have a title based on the identifier, the type of item it is, that is the document type. So in this case, a letter, who it's from, who it's to, the date, who it mentions, right? So name mentions, here's a subject. So in this case, it happens to be about the Edison Miller family. Miller was his second wife's name. And then some other information, including where it is in our microfilm edition. The rights information. Eventually, these will turn into permanent URLs. We were just adding that. And we're continuing to add other things to these as well. You can, play around with the image to some extent. So the other thing that we've been doing is creating a series of indexes and finding aids to all of this. So you can explore by topic, that is the various subjects. I don't know how useful this is, but it's sometimes a good way just to kind of explore the larger archive, divided up by decades. So there's 10-year periods. You can find each author, recipient, or name mentioned. It provides a list of all the names. These also then provide, just to give you a sense of this, right, gives you the formal name that they were indexed by, which then becomes useful if you want to do an item search and you want to search by, let's say, author, recipient, or name mention, and have the exact name. You can do that, right? So that's another way in which one can explore these things. You can explore by document type. So if you wanted to see all the technical documents, for example, you could do that, right? Repository, so if you're interested in stuff that came mostly from not the Edison National Historical Park, you can find that as well. This is a link to the Microfilm Collection on the Internet Archive. And then this is essentially this redone in a somewhat different form, because now it has a link to, so here is the item set for this notebook, right? There are the documents. Turns out that a lot of notebooks only have one indexed item because there's either no date or only one date. Or you can open up the Internet Archive. So there's the notebook, and you can read through the notebook, which can sometimes be very useful. This particular one is undated. It doesn't have a lot of drawings in it, but it may in fact be related to some work he was doing with his ore milling project in the 1890s. So there are various ways that you can access these materials. One of the things we've been doing is creating that notebook collection, and one of the things that we're going to do is actually then use the microfilm to create a separate notebook collection in Omeka S. One of the reasons for that is, oops, here we go. Not so much this one, but some of the notebooks where there are multiple documents, knowing where a document starts and another one ends is easier to tell when you're actually reading through the whole notebook rather than going document by document, as you would have to do in a MEC-S. So this is these are the various ways that we've tried to take this immense amount of archival material and make it accessible in various ways. And we're still kind of working through how we're going to do certain things. So we are planning on taking all those outside repository materials and creating PDF files for each folder of material and putting those on the Internet Archive. So there'll be, a second version of the Edison Papers digital edition on the Internet Archive. And then we're trying to figure out a way to hopefully create an integrated edition. I'm going to stop sharing at the moment. Integrated edition, what we're thinking about is something sort of like a reading room where, are you folks familiar with Mirador? I should actually show you one way that we're thinking about doing that. Let me, hoping I can, yeah, here we go. Mirador home. Let me go back to sharing my screen again. Share. So with Mirador, you can actually have not just two items like this, but you could have a whole series of items that you bring together to view in a browser window. You could compare, for example, two different notebook entries from the same day in different notebooks in the Edison papers. You could bring in material from from the Hoffe Trust. So most of the primary materials that Edison, the primary publications that Edison used in his research and that of his laboratories are on the Hoffe Trust, so that you could bring those in and view those. So that's one of the ways we're thinking about then turning this collection of stuff into sort of creating a reading room for it, so you could bring together different materials. So I'll stop there. That's a lot to try and absorb and understand, obviously, and be happy to answer questions, discuss whatever you'd like regarding what it is that we're trying to do. You're sort of stunned trying to figure out what to say about it.
Where to start? Yeah. Thank you so much for that presentation.
Yeah. So one of the things about the Edison papers is trying to introduce people to it. It's so, complicated that it's a little hard to absorb when you first encounter it. So Monica can actually talk a bit about the Internet Archive, because she's been very involved in the processes that are involved in trying to take the material that we have and actually bring it into the Internet Archive. So that's another part of this project that might be valuable as you are thinking about your own archival materials, how to make it accessible in various ways. And I mentioned there are a number of libraries that have begun to do just that with some of their archival materials.
Excuse me.
Sure.
I've got a question.
Absolutely.
Are you considering at any point doing a ADA review or audit of your website?
So the new website is that is being done for the new website. The old website was created a long time ago and needs some serious updating. That's why we're doing a new website. So hopefully so are you talking about the website, or are you talking about the MEC-S digital edition?
I'm talking about the website that, people with disabilities can actually navigate it
Yeah, so that is one of the things that we're doing with the website, the edison.rutgers.edu website, will definitely be being developed with ADA. The digital image edition is a little bit more difficult because that's using an existing platform, and we're trying to manage that figure out how to manage that for some of the things that we're doing in the digital image edition. So one of the things we are talking about, one possibility, I'm hoping we're going to have discussions with the university about creating something that can be maintained by the Rutgers Library, which may or not be Omega S by the time we're through, to manage the digital image edition. And whatever we do, we do plan to make ADA compliant.
Thank you.
Actually, I have a few questions, but I'll try to
Sure.
lump them together.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit? I'm familiar with the Edison Historical Site, National Historical Site, and what they have there, at least just looking at a little bit of what's there. About how you interact with the National Park Service. Are you actively digitizing things or working through the microfilm?
Very good question. So, there were sort of two stages. So in the 1980s, 1990s is when we produced our microfilm edition, which basically goes up to 1919. We are actively working with them now in the 1920s. And so instead of microfilm, we're actually digitizing that material. And we will be putting that online. That will be, so there will be some advantages to that. So obviously the quality of microfilm images is not as good as a good color scan. I wish we could go back and redo the Edison papers as a digital edition from the start, but we have to rely on our microfilm because we don't have the resources to redigitize anything other than microfilm. But the new images will be high quality color scans of the various folders or books that will be including from the 1920s.
And my second part of the question was about the National Archives funding. I guess it's NHPRC or the other funds that you've gotten for it. If you could talk a little bit about,
Sure.
Because I know that those things are usually in grant cycles. So it's
Right.
for a part of a project and not its eternal maintenance. And I was just
Right.
curious if you've had multiple rounds or how you've structured that.
Yes. So we've been both the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, that is the NHPRC, have been significant funders of the Edison Papers Project for a long time. They have enabled us to create what we've created. And yes, there are grant cycles, and I'm the one that gets to write all those grant proposals. NHPRC, for those of you in the archive world, is actually a very important partner. So this is part of the National Archive. And so they're funding, they were actually originally created as the National Historical Publications Commission to actually fund historical scholarly editing projects like ours. And then they broadened their work to include grants for archives. And so there are projects in all of the states that have been funded through NHPRC to organize, digitize, make accessible various kinds of archival records. So NHPRC has, usually their cycles are just 1 year of funding, so you have to reapply if you're allowed to. Unfortunately for the Edison papers, the scholarly editing projects, that has been the case. However, they are trying to get those of us who've been around a long time to finish up. So we are in the process of creating a 10-year plan to finish because we will only get 10 more years of funding from them. NEH is also looking to think about how they want to move forward. They have an ongoing, amongst their many grant programs, is one for scholarly editions like ours. NEH tends to have somewhat longer grant cycles, 2 or 3 years at a time. There's a couple that are even a little longer than that. So grant funding is obviously one of the things that is crucial to a project like this, but also something that those of you involved in archives might look to for projects that you might do within your own archive.
If no one else has another question, of course, I've got another,
Go
because I
ahead.
always have questions. So this is always a fun question. I'm always curious as to what percentage of the collection has either been microfilmed and or digitized. And if you still take pieces into the collection, if it's still open, do you, if something were to come for auction or donation, I'm sure there's no money for auction items, but just curious whether it could be added to or if it's closed.
Yes. So, in fact, that's a very good question. So the national, the archive at the Edison National Historical Park, while most of that material was donated along with the park in the 1950s, they have continued to acquire collections. Right, so some of those special collections that I mentioned are papers of people who were associated with Edison in one way or another that have been donated to them. More recently, the papers of Edison's youngest son, Theodore Edison, who was an important engineer, inventor, and environmentalist, were donated. And so that's a big collection that they added. We have, as I said, gone out and searched for materials in other archives. We also keep our eyes on auction catalogs and various web auctions and so forth. And there's a group of materials that we have added to our digital image edition that were materials that we were able to get access to and permission via the auction houses. And so we have a number of items that we have included that, in fact, are in personal collections. And we've also contacted people we know have personal collections. And we have actually a couple of larger collections that we got from individuals who collected stuff and made them accessible to us to digitize and put online.
I'm trying to get a handle on the scope, I guess. You're an archive, a repository, an aggregator.
Okay, let me try. Yeah, that's what I was trying to show at the beginning, but it's a little hard to kind of grasp. So the Edison Papers was founded with the idea that it was going to do a scholarly edition of Edison's papers. Because of the size of the collection as it was understood at the time, we decided we would start with a microfilm edition to select the most significant documents. We didn't select everything because, as we discovered, there were more than 1.2 million. It turned out to be about 5 million pages of stuff in that archive. So
who holds that archive?
So that's the Thomas Edison National Historical Park in West Orange.
Okay.
Right. So it's owned by the National Park Service, or the U.S. government through the National Park Service. There's a huge collection of papers that were already there that had been Edison's and his companies and his laboratory records, and then the Thomas A. Edison Incorporated, which was the company that aggregated all the Edison companies together in the in 1911 and continued to have an existence for a long time. Then it was combined with another company called McGraw, so it became McGraw Edison. So they donated the records from the period of Edison's life to the archive as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why nobody quite knew how much stuff there was, because those were in some outer vaults that were built during Edison's time. The actual main vault was built during World War I, partially as a bomb shelter and partially as an archival storage facility. So it turned out that there was a lot more stuff than anybody thought. And a lot of it are these corporate records. So we focused on the key collections most closely associated with Edison, but that included a number of company records where Edison himself was involved to a great degree in the operations of the company, and then decided we couldn't do the aggregate company, Thomas A. Edison Inc. There was just too much stuff. So, out of those 5 million pages of stuff, we'll probably end up with somewhere around 300,000 to 350,000 pages.
You just hold the scans, you don't hold the original.
Right. So what we have are two things. We have microfilm of the stuff that was in that. Most of the stuff we have from the Edison National Historical Park was originally in the microfilm edition. So we scanned the microfilm. We weren't able to go back in. We didn't have the resources to go back in and rescan everything as nice color images. And then the stuff that we are still scanning or still preparing and then scanning from the 1920s, those will be scanned and not microfilm. Then in addition to that, we have got material from many other archives, around 100 altogether, archives and personal collections that we have acquired materials related to Edison and his companies. And those we have gotten in a variety of forms, originally Xeroxes when we first started collecting that material. More recently, we've gotten digital scans from people. And in some cases, we've gone to the libraries or archives and gotten scans from those. So there's a lot of material. Altogether, we'll have around 150 to 170,000 documents. It'll be somewhere around 300,000 or more images. It's mostly stuff from the main archive, but there are a lot of other materials that come from other collections. And so we're trying to aggregate all those together and make them accessible and searchable. Also trying to tie in the work that we've done with the transcribed and annotated book edition as well.
If I may interject, it's not that unusual in scholarly editing projects for the institution who is doing it to either not own anything or own only a part.
Right.
The idea is to bring together, say, all the material relating to a specific individual, no matter where it might be, and then publish that in a scholarly edition. I visited the Thomas Jefferson Project at Princeton, and yeah, they've got a whole bunch of
Jefferson didn't have much
from
to do
all
with
over
New Jersey.
Yeah, and they still use those Xeroxes in the editing project, but they also now are getting scans and that sort of thing from other repositories as well. So if you like, the scholarly editions were kind of the first aggregator projects,
right?
Just not online.
That's right. And now, in fact, increasingly, so the Founding Fathers papers, for example, Project Rotunda, University of Virginia Press, has been working with the Founding Fathers papers. Here again, NHPRC provided some funding, extra monies that came from Congress specifically for the Founding Fathers papers to put digital versions online. And so there's a good example of projects that in all cases are aggregators. There aren't necessarily big collections in any one place for most of the Founding Fathers, but they've found them from all over and made them accessible initially through book editions and now increasingly through this digital rotunda. Yeah. Anything else?
I have a question.
Sure.
Hi, I'm a second semester student in the archives concentration, and I'm actually taking a preservation course, so this is all very interesting. I think as somebody who's an emerging archivist, I'm really interested in learning more about the kinds of users and how the users experience changes as the digitization process evolves. So if you could say two things, over the past year or two, or recently, who are the kinds of researchers using the Edison papers?
Sure.
And how do you think their experiences have changed compared to maybe 10 years ago or so?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously our edition changed recently, and some people who had gotten used to the old version, including the archivist at the Edison National Historical Park, are grumbling a little bit because they haven't quite figured out the nuances of the new edition, although I think over time they'll discover there are a lot more capabilities. And that's one of the reasons we're also creating finding aids. So one of the finding aids we're working on, for example, right now is a finding aid to all the corporate records. There's about 100 companies that we're going to, actually more than that, I think 150 companies that we're compiling a finding aid for the records in the collection related to all these companies. So part of it is, how you provide access to stuff. So for example, the original digital edition was not designed for the subject indexing we had done. One of the reasons for that is that subject indexing was done initially just for internal purposes. And we were, I think, reluctant to share that. But then, my feeling once I became director was, why worry about it? It's better than nothing. And, it actually is really useful. I mean, we were using it. Why not allow other people to use it? So that's one of the things is we've been trying to make the metadata more and more usable in various ways, both through search and through finding aids. The types of users we have. So one of the things that putting an edition online changed was also who was using these scholarly resources. It turns out that besides scholars, and there are a lot of scholars that have used the Edison papers over the years, they continue to use the Edison papers for books, articles, and not just historians, not just people interested in science, technology, and business. We've had people involved in engineering education who have looked at the Edison papers material. We've had people involved in sort of cognitive psychology, trying to understand creativity, look at the Edison papers. So there's a lot of ways in which having this stuff now accessible means that other people are thinking about it in different ways than we might have if we just stayed as a scholarly editing project, with this microfilm edition out there and some books, and not really have the kind of interaction that we now have with users. I mean, we have more interaction with users than we used to. Another of the probably the most surprising, although it shouldn't be that surprising in this day and age, but it was when it initially started. Now it's become so common that one doesn't think twice. People doing genealogical research on their families who discover people in our collection. We have, I'm trying to remember what the number is. I think it's around 18,000 names in our index. and they're not just people who were associated directly with Edison. They're people who, wrote to Edison or his companies from all over. And now suddenly they're finding material related to their ancestors. So that's one of the really new ways that having this stuff digitized and online means that it now becomes part of this much broader collection of material that genealogists can use. We also are doing a lot to try and make this more accessible for educational purposes. One of the things NEH has funded over the years are teachers institutes, and I've gone to many of those as a participant to show teachers ways to think about how they might use the Edison papers, not just to think about invention in American culture, but to think about the role of science and technology. Edison was involved in a couple of major media innovations, sound recording and motion pictures, right? And so they can use materials there to sort of talk about the emergence of new media, right? Or to use the kinds of things that were being recorded on record and film to talk about cultural aspects of the culture, or to use the sort of large, we have an enormous amount of material clippings related to Edison, who was a major cultural figure in the late 19th and most of the 20th century, and ways to think about how you can use those kind of materials as well. So now, of course, there's increasingly collections of newspapers online. The Library of Congress has been working with various state organizations that originally microfilmed newspaper collections, and now those are being digitized to be added to Chronicling America, the Library of Congress newspaper aggregator. And so there are all sorts of ways now in which these kinds of materials become accessible to people who would never have walked into a library and used a microfilm reader, but now they can search for and find stuff online that they had no idea they were interested in.
That was a great answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Are you involved with any of the audio recordings, restorations and things?
That's a very good question. So there are two kinds of materials that I just talked about. One is motion pictures. Motion pictures are very interesting. So the Library of Congress has a huge collection of Edison films. The reason for that is that Edison couldn't copyright the films. He could copyright photographs, and so they did paper prints of each frame of a film and deposited in the Library of Congress to copyright it. In the 1950s, they figured out how to convert those back to film, and so the Library of Congress has a huge collection of Edison films. A lot of those have been taken by people and put on YouTube now, but the Library of Congress has the biggest collection. Sound recordings are a somewhat different issue. So the University of California at Santa Barbara, which is actually where I got my master's in public history way back when, they have a huge project. They're collaborating with Library of Congress, which has sound recordings, and with other repositories that have recordings to digitize not just the Edison material, but all of the sound recordings of the acoustic era, right? Which is really from the late 1880s to through the 1920s. So they've been digitizing initially the cylinder recordings. Now there are projects to begin to digitize discs. So the Victor Company actually did discs, not cylinders. Edison eventually went to discs. The masters for all the Edison disc recordings are in the vaults at the National Park, and they have a huge project that they're going to do to digitize all of those. And so there are these ongoing digitization projects, including their digitization projects So there were people who used phonographs, for example, to record native peoples, to record animals, primates, for example, and some of those recordings exist. There's a collection of recordings. This guy who got a hold of an Edison phonograph and traveled to Russia. And so there's a bunch of recordings that were done and I think they're 1889, 1890. Some of those still survive and have been digitized and made available. So there's a whole range of materials. And so one of the things that we want to do as we create these finding aids is also point to other related collections that are not going to be in the Edison papers, but are definitely directly related to it, like these sound recording and film collections.
I have another question.
Sorry.
Okay, why don't we start with the, let's see, James, why don't you go ahead, and then whoever was after James, I'm not sure.
One thing that I wanted to ask is, are there any plans later on to relate the transcript in the book volumes to any material that you have images for? Because I noticed when I visited the site, you had the images up, but there were no transcripts with
So
them.
let me talk a little about transcripts. So we have transcripts in our book edition, and we've had some preliminary discussions with Johns Hopkins University Press about the materials on Project Muse. We're not quite sure exactly what we're going to do to bring those together. One way may just be the easiest, which would be to take the PDFs of the volumes and make those part of our collection. Or there may be a way that we can work with Hopkins to enable those back and forth. We have just begun working in Omega S. The folks at the Rosenzweig Center have a transcription tool called Scripto. We have a lot of transcriptions that have been done by our work study students, by some part-time people, by some volunteers of documents. We've done a good, I would say the majority of the readily transcribable material from the 19th century has been done, and we're starting to put that into Scripto to correct them, and then they will start appearing as transcriptions in the image edition. So you'll have not just the image, but the transcription as well. I can actually, I'm just gonna show if I can just give you a sense of what that will look like. So we are very definitely looking at how to do that. So I'm gonna find one of these that I know has been done. So here's one, and so this is the back end. This is not yet on the front end, but there's the image for the document. There's the transcription. All right, and we're doing very simple transcriptions. We're not trying to do anything too complicated, as we do with the book edition, where we try to do a lot more formatting and so forth. But we are going to be making these transcriptions available. And of course, they do two things besides making it easier to, so these are typed, so they're pretty easy to read. Handwritten documents, obviously, a little more difficult. So we're doing both handwritten and typed documents, but they also are then text searchable. And so this will add to our ability to make the material accessible, not just through subject indexing and names, but also through text searching, So that will further make the material available in a different way.
Thank you.
There's another question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I wanted to ask another question that another participant asked about sound recordings. So I actually, in my preservation course this semester, just produced a leaflet on lacquer transcription discs, or otherwise known as instantaneous discs.
Right.
And you are officially the first person who's responded with "Oh," by the way, as if you know what I'm talking about. So that's exciting. Nobody knows what they are. So I had to ask a question about them. I learned about this technology that I think is involved with the Northeast Document Conservation. Forgive me.
Yeah, that's right.
It's
Northeast Document Conservation Center. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yes. So there's it's a 2D, 3D digital scanner. I think the acronym spells out Irene, like the person's name. And what it does is it takes a 3D image of the grooves in these discs, especially these lacquer discs, which are made out of nitrocellulose, of course, and all kinds of other things that are extremely delicate. I'm sure you're very well aware, especially the cylinders, of course, probably the most delicate. And I was wondering if there's involvement with that technology. One of the things I learned is it's expensive.
Yes.
But I'm really, you might be the first person and the only person in the next few months I can ask this question to. So forgive me if it's a kind of detailed question, if it's not relevant to the presentation, but
that's okay.
I'd like to ask a question about that.
Go ahead.
So I was just wondering if the Edison papers and the Edison institution that holds those actual physical original materials is involved in digitization via 3D scanning.
Yes. So very good question. The answer to that is we are not, but Jerry Fabris, who is the sound recording archivist, who's somebody you might want to talk to. Actually, I can give you his contact information. So he has been working with various people to digitize various things related to, obviously, the Edison materials, including, and I mentioned those master cylinders, or master discs, I mean, not master cylinders. I don't know what process they're using for that, but I know he knows a lot about the various kinds of digitization processes that have been used by all of these projects to digitize recordings of one sort or another. He's really probably the person I know best personally to talk to about that, and he can put you in touch with other people as well. And so, yeah, there's a whole area of sound recording archives, right, which is very involved in both preserving and digitizing this material. And so some of the earliest Edison recordings using Edison's early tinfoil phonograph, those were digitized, very, very similar processes to the one you're talking about, because they're extremely fragile. That's why they haven't been played in well over a century, right? Like 150 years almost. But they can be digitized. And so there are these very fragile records now that have been digitized and made. In fact, they even were able to do, so before Edison, there was going to space out on the name of the guy. There was actually I'm gonna do a quick, there we go. So if you go to the Edison National Historical Park website, which I'm going to put in there in the chat here for anybody that's interested in, under Learn About the Park, there's a whole section about their sound recordings, including something called a symposium about who invented recorded sound, or And there's this guy, Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville, who figured out how to record but not play back sound recordings in 1857 with his phonautograph. And there were these recordings he deposited that, you know, people could look at, but they couldn't hear. Those have been digitized, right?
Hmm.
1857 by these
Very
processes.
cool.
So, right, ARSC is another organization that's been very involved in this as well. Somebody put that in the chat. So there's a lot of work going on with the digitization of sound recordings. And of course, preservation of motion pictures is a big deal as well. You know, we're fortunate that Edison wanted to copyright his films. So we have these paper prints that could be converted back into film. Otherwise, those would have disappeared, right? As have so many of the early motion pictures. Anything else?
I have one last question, unless anyone else has anything they want to go for. First of all, I just want to say thank you, Paul. And I've worked with Edison papers. I feel like it's such a good experience to see how an archive naturally evolves and the
Magically, yes,
different,
right.
you know, it's the different things you have to encounter and trial and error that goes into things, at least on my part. But I guess my last question is, you've already touched on, you know, the indexing and the metadata as being one of the greatest points to access the material. And as somebody who has done a lot of research with archival material and also chosen how to organize and archive the material, if you were talking to an archivist who might not have as much, be more on the archivist side in the digital archiving world, you know, as we go forward and try to get different careers like that, what would you have us think we should look out for?
Oh,
The
you know,
trade.
that's a really good question, because one of the things, so archives traditionally have not indexed down to the item level, right? They indexed to folders and volumes and so forth. So, you know, that's a different kind of thing than what we did. I mean, in part because we started as a scholarly editing project rather than as an archival project. That was part of the way in which we interpreted our mission, right? Any archive, especially larger ones, has so many collections that indexing down to that level becomes more difficult. But what's increasingly begun to happen, the National Archives has been doing this, other libraries and archives have been doing it as well, is digitizing materials, not necessarily doing more than minimal indexing of the items, and then making them available for crowdsourced transcription or tagging, which is another way to think about how to add metadata to a collection, right? And so, and obviously, you know, the development of the electronic finding aids, the AEDs that have emerged in the archival community, you know, thinking about how those might be linked to a set of digitized materials that maybe aren't indexed to the item level, but then could be made accessible in ways that will allow the tagging or transcription of the materials. That's another way to sort of think about this. You know, a lot of it depends on the kind of resources you have in your own organization as to what you will be able to do. But there are certainly, you know, various ways to think about how to have enough metadata to make stuff accessible, and then are there ways to, you know, use crowdsourcing or other ways of adding to metadata over time, right?
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
All right. Well, unless anyone has any other last minute questions, I think we can wrap up. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate hearing from you and hope everyone enjoyed it.
And please feel free to get in touch if you have, questions that come to mind after all of this. Always happy to help or to offer some insights from what we've done. So that's certainly something I offer to everybody. So.
Great.